Hello everyone, and welcome to this virtual event by HealthTech Hub Copenhagen. Our topic today is your medical software product ready for MDR and the new requirements? And our guest is Brian Hedegaard, CEO of Probatus. Before we move on to the next 2 hours, where we dive deep into MDR, I would like to give you a quick introduction of HealthTech Hub Copenhagen. Then Brian takes over, and at the end of this session, we will have a quick Q&A, so please remember to post your questions in the chat right here. Who are we at HealthTech Hub Copenhagen? Our first goal is to break the adoption bottlenecks in healthcare and open the way for clever health tech solutions to reach the people they are meant to serve. But we also have a big ambition. We want to improve the health and reduce health-related costs for 1 billion people worldwide. We will reach this goal together with our members, who are growing in numbers, and our dedicated partners. With our 5 accelerating forces for the health tech ecosystem, we work together with startups, mature organizations, healthcare organizations, ecosystem supporters, in accelerating the adoption of clever health tech solutions. We're both a launching pad, a catalyzer, and a landing pad for startups, established companies, and everybody in the health tech ecosystem. I would like to give the word to my colleague Roeen, who will set the scene for medical device regulation.
The first thing that we want to say, first and foremost, is that we're seeing an increasing appetite for digital health. Whether it's patients, consumers, doctors, hospitals, the broader healthcare sector, including insurance companies and payers, demand is strong and has been for some years, to be honest. But we've lacked a framework for this adoption to really occur. But now we're seeing these sort of larger reimbursement schemes appearing. Just a few months ago, Germany's Digital Care Act went live. And this is something we can call, a helping hand. And as these reimbursement schemes get going, digital health companies increasingly are eyeing out an upside in adoption of digital therapeutics, which makes them more embracive on embarking a regulatory journey, something that in the past, at least historically, has been a major barrier. So this helping hand, I think, is an important trend that to have in mind. Historically, in health tech and in general technology in healthcare, these sort of larger reimbursement schemes have had a huge impact. Most notably, electronic health records created a $1 billion world market, although not always pretty, but still a sustainable market that exists till this day. We can say, well, as these structures are more and more solid, we're also going to see shifts in how growth is being established, a more sustainable way of growing. There's a lot of digital health solutions on the market today, and especially within the app domain, and with varying quality as well. And a lot of these solutions have not necessarily grown through providing evidence on their solution or in any way showing efficacy for patient outcomes, etc. It's more been on a tactical promotional level, driving user base retention and so on. But as these sort of more serious frameworks are being established, growth will be driven more so by proving the efficacy of your product, showing patient outcomes, etc., and building your user base and increasing your retention of your product based on these metrics and not so much on how much you promote on various channels. And then the final thing that I think is very important and worth sharing today is two-sided network effects, and we expect this to really take hold in digital health as well. Historically, when it comes to digital health, the focus has been patients and consumers, opening up the healthcare sector, increasing access, democratizing health. And these are very important topics. But we've also neglected, to some extent, the other side of the equation, the hospitals, the healthcare sector in general, doctors, etc., understanding their side of things. But as these digital health solutions increasingly are classified as medical devices, are approved for the respective claims they're making on outcomes, etc., the healthcare sector will become advocates for these solutions. And these solutions will benefit them in many ways, whether it is better outcomes, efficiencies, and so on. This will introduce a dynamic, often referred to as two-sided network effects. It will help digital health companies scale more efficiently, and in general, create a more positive environment for adoption of these solutions. And where does MDR tie in all of this? You could say, again, when it comes to regulatory affairs, this has often been seen as a hindrance to innovation, or in any way, startups or small companies. But I think it's key to look at MDR or any other regulatory framework as an opportunity to show what does your product have to contribute, and use that framework to establish competitive advantage. I think this is a different mindset than what we've typically viewed regulatory as. And with that, I just want to hand it over to Brian so he can inform and enlighten us as regards to MDR. Brian, take it away.
Thank you. On my screen here. So, and I guess my screen is shared now.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks. Well, thank you for having me to speak today and to speak about this exciting topic about the medical device regulations, which has often is seen as you just mentioned, Rin, that it's a killer of innovation and business. And to be honest, it's with this medical device regulation as opposed to the medical device directive that we used to have. It is somehow also lowering the what's called the incentive to do innovation or innovative product, because it has become a lot more cumbersome to actually place on the market new devices. But let's have a look at it and how it will go through today. The agenda today will be a short introduction to the European legislation, medical device directive and the regulation, and talk about when things become a medical device. And this is just to make sure that we, all of us, has kind of the same understanding of the framework that we will be working within when we are talking about medical devices. And as we cannot in this forum and now having it virtual, go through each of your backgrounds and get to know what your background is. So please bear with me if this is really basic knowledge that I come to go through today, and do raise hands to Annette or Rin if it's too high level, so that we're talking cross-heads. That's not the intention, at least. After that, I'll dive more into the state of the medical device regulation implementation and the transition from medical device directives to the regulation, and what will be the consequence of this up-classification of software in particular that has come with the regulation. And then a short break, and then I'll dive a little bit further into some details on how we can address some of the topics that are most relevant to software from the general safety and performance requirements point of view, which is where we are actually to state compliance with. Yes, and then we'll have the questions and answers. And if you do have questions during the presentation, please do write them in the chat, and Rin will collect them, and we'll try to answer best efforts at the end of the session. So CE marking is all about gaining market access and within the European legislation. For FDA, it would be an FDA approval or at least a registration. The CE marking is based on European legislation, which is expressed in either directives or regulations, and currently we have the Medical Device Directive, and we have ENT directives, we have radio emitting devices directives, and directives for a lot of other things, which has been issued from EU government side, and as Denmark is a member of EU, we have signed a treaty which obligates, require us to implement the directive into national laws, and thereby the directive become a national law with the interpretations that are in each individual member state, and that it can give some variations. With all these directives, the EU is asking for the SEN standardization organization to draw up or adopt some standards from either SEN or from other standardization organizations, which can be used to state compliance with the directives. So whenever we are to fulfill the requirements, we can, by stating compliance to a certain standard, we can assume that we are in compliance also with those parts of the directive that these standards are covering. And these standards, they are also adopted as national standards in the member states. Like, so when it becomes a DS standard, then it's the standard that has been adopted in Denmark in order to fulfill the national laws. So now with the regulation, these EN standards, they will also be addressing the requirements from the regulations, and the regulation, as opposed to the directive, is applying across all member states at once. So at the date of application or the date of stepping into effect from the regulation, it was applied across Europe without the national interpretations that could have been there, as was the case with the directives. So that here we have the biggest difference between the regulation and the directive. This gives us an advantage that actually we are following exactly the same legislation across all countries in Europe, which is quite good. Now, these standards that has been issued as EN standard, they are also referred to as harmonized standards because of this case where you can use the standards in order to fulfill the requirements of the regulation. And those standards that are most relevant for software as medical devices, or software medical devices, medical device software, are these, where especially the IEC 62304 is very important because it describes the software development life cycle, but also risk management, as risk management is in everything that we work with when we're talking about medical devices. Then there's one for 13485 for quality management system, a usability standard, a general safety standard for software, and then one for clinical investigation, should we have such. The AMI TIR 57 is a very good standard to use for cybersecurity, but it's not going to be a harmonized standard. In fact, there is currently no harmonized standard at all for the medical device regulation. That will come sometime or start coming in the start spring 2021. So hopefully we will see them harmonized soon, so we can actually make use of them in order to establish compliance with these standards. Disregarded, harmonized or not, we should be anytime using the latest version of these standards in order to state compliance with the medical device regulation. Currently, for instance, the 2012 edition of this risk management standard is harmonized to the directive, but it's the 2019 edition which is the current version and the ones that we should be used. In order to guide us in the implementation of all these legislative requirements and fulfilling them, EU, the Medical Device Coordinators Group, has issued a bunch of guidance, quite a few actually, and there are more coming continually. And the ones that are most relevant to software is the 2019-11, the 2019-16, 2020-1 and 05, and 2018-05. A lot of numbers will be mentioned also through the presentation, but these about qualifying and classifying standalone software for cybersecurity, establishing clinical evaluation. This one is replacing or expanding the MedDev 271 for clinical evaluation, as was the one to be used for the directive. This is still a good one to look into, but it is this guidance, 2020-1, that is the one to follow now. You can find all these medical device coordinated group guidance documents through this link. Now, the CE mark is placed and must be placed on all products which are within the scope of one or more of the directives or regulations which are requiring CE mark. And that goes for medical device, for automotive, for aerospace, for measuring devices, explosives, and a lot of other areas where they are requiring actually the CE mark to be placed on it. The intent with the CE mark is to ensure free movement of goods across the European continent, or within EU at least, and the OECD. Yeah, and that's the purpose of it. If you should see a CE mark with 4 digits next to it, it just indicates that a notified body within that area to which the device is falling within scope, that the notified body has been issuing a certificate of compliance to the legislation that applies for that area. So it's a good indication that at least a third party has been looking at the device or at the technical documentation prior to placing on the market. Now, all of this legislative talk is bringing us to a state where we need to figure out how, which of these legislations are our device actually within scope of. And the main, we call it, thing to look at when to define which legislations apply is the intended purpose. And the intended purpose is defined in the medical device regulation, article 2.12, and it basically is what the device is doing, and it is what is said about the device on labels and instructions for use, any promotional or sales materials, or any other statements where you are stating that your device is capable of doing whatever it's capable of doing. You may at conferences or the like, when performing research or in early stages, state that you are working on a device that will be or is intended to be able to do something in the future. then it will not be regarded as intended use of a particular device. But otherwise, the intended purpose, intended use is really an important statement to make, or a sentence to draw up, because it actually is giving us a foundation to evaluate which legislations apply, what is the risk classification of the device, and what level of quality management are we to establish, what kind of insights are we to give the authorities into our device and our organization. So it's really crucial, and I'll come back to more cases on this later. Now, when defining an intended purpose on a device which are to be used in healthcare or in medical device, we are looking at a formulation of the sentence there, where it must have a medical purpose in order to qualify as a medical device. And in addition to this medical purpose, it has to fit within one of the bullets mentioned here. So it is addressing diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, prediction, prognosis, treatment, or alleviation of diseases, injury, or disability. And if your device is falling within these scopes and it has a medical purpose, it is most likely a medical device, or you can assume that it is a medical device, and therefore regulated by the medical device regulation. An example on why it is really important how you formulate this intended purpose is these two apps. And just by skimming across them, you'll see that they are very, very, very identical, or almost identical in the statement, but they have two different, significantly different risk classifications. App A being a class 1 device, while the app B is becoming a class 2B device. One does not require involvement of authorities, and you are self-certifying, and the other one is requiring a significant level of clinical evidence and involvement of notified body for assessing and certifying your quality management system, and on the technical documentation to issue a certificate of compliance to the legislation. And actually, if you look at the first line here, app A is intended to support conception, while the other one is intended to prevent conception. And here the risk is to become pregnant unintended, while here the risk would be that you become pregnant sooner than expected. And here you're using the app in order to become pregnant, so that would not really count as a risk, while the other one is to avoid getting pregnant, and therefore it ends up in a class 2B. So even just single words may make a huge difference in the way it is seen when we talk about intended purpose. Now, devices, software devices, or software in general, can be segmented into these 4 groups, where we have a column which are general use in health and well-being without a medical purpose, and therefore not regulated as a medical device. And then we have set which are to be embedded into some hardware, and some that are to run on generic hardware platforms like PCs, tablets, or smartphones. And what we're looking at today for this presentation is the group of software that falls within scope of the medical device regulation, which are clearly for general purpose, but have a medical purpose as well. A couple of standards mentioned here is the 62304, because it applies to all types of software which are medical devices. while the 82304 standard applies to all software that are used within healthcare, disregarded whether it is a medical device or not. The transition or the story of the medical device regulation is that back in 2017, in April, the medical device regulation was published, and on the 26th of May 2017, it was stepping into effect, and the transition period was starting, and it was supposed to end by 26th of May 2020, but due to COVID-19, and Corrigendum 2 was issued, expanding the transition period with another year. And so now we are actually 3.5 years within this transition period, and it is very unlikely that it will be moved once again. When we're talking about medical devices that may be able to be placed on the market before 26th of May under the Medical Device Directive, it may be a good idea to pursue that solution for your device, because it will give you the opportunity to stay in the market until actually 26th of May 2025. There are some what's called concerns or prerequisites in order to stay in the market until then, and one is that that it can be, your device is now a Class 1 device, and it will be up classified to a Class 2A, a Class 2B, or a Class 3 device. Here maybe we should mention that all medical devices are split into 4 classes: Class 1, which is the lowest risk classification, Class 2A, 2B, and Class 3. Class 3 is high risk devices, which could be causing death or irreversible harm to patients. But devices that are under the Medical Device Directive, a Class 1 device, and will become a Class 2A device under the Medical Device Regulation, can, if they are placed on the market before 26th of May, be granted access and may be sold until 26th of May 2025, provided that there are made no significant changes to the device in that period. And I'll get back to what is a significant change in a second. In addition, the last year is sell out of stock year. So here we cannot make no patches, disregarded how small it is to the device. So in reality, for software, the end of life date is 26th of May 2024 for any software. And after all devices that are placed on the market after 26th of May 2024, they must conform with the Medical Device Regulation, or if they are within the in vitro diagnostic regulation, then they must comply with the in vitro diagnostic regulation. The lower graph here is the notified body availability, and as you can see, there was quite an increase at the end of 2019, and then we got struck by COVID, and it has been very, very slowly growing since then. We are currently at 18 notified bodies, and it should increase up to, at some point, to 50, but with the current pace, it's taking a lot of several years before we get to that point. So that's not good, because as you can see, we have this in vitro diagnostic devices that they are to transition into a in vitro diagnostic regulation by 2022, meaning that they will take up some capacity within this notified body system. So this is really a bottleneck in the regulatory process of bringing medical devices to the market in these years. Now, Significant changes are changes which may cause an adverse effect on the device, and it may be as simple as an upgrade from 32 to 64-bit of the operating system. So unless we can state in a risk analysis that the update of OS does not have any impact on the clinical performance or safety or other performance of the device, then we are to consider that as a significant change, and thereby we have to comply with the medical device regulation and no longer the medical device directive. There is in this guidance document MDCG 2020-3 this flowchart, and I'm sorry it's too small here to read it, but it states that in the first one, if there's a major change to OS or any other component of the software, then it is considered a significant change. If there are changes to the architecture of the software, database structure, or to an algorithm within the software, then it is considered a significant change. If it's adding new diagnostic and therapeutic features, it's a significant change. New UI or representation of data is also considered a significant change. So only if we kind of move a control on a screen or move a button on the screen to another location within the same screen, it can be regarded as non-significant. And also some security patches are considered non-significant changes. But in general, as we are talking about software, this long transition period with additional 4 years until 2024 is not really feasible for most software. So you should definitely go for complying with the medical device regulation ASAP. Yes. So now when we are focusing on the medical device regulation only now, there are some major changes that are affecting software, and one thing is the prediction and prognosis, and it's, these two terms have been integrated into the definition of being a medical device, and any use of these two will somehow more or less involve software in some way to analyze information and provide new information. There's a requirement for redundancy, or implicitly it states a requirement for redundancy, because we are to reduce or eliminate risk of impairment following a single fault condition. So we shall develop and manufacture our software in a way so that it should not cause any risk from a single fault condition. Another thing that is important is that it's a life cycle focus now, as opposed to the previous legislation, where it was only focusing to be validated according to state of the art. Now it has to be developed and manufactured according to state of the art, meaning that we are looking at the full end-to-end development or life cycle of the device. Meaning that we should be paying more attention to the life cycle process in any of the standards that are relevant or applicable for our device. Other topics that are kind of hot topics is that software as service is included, so disregarded from where in the world that your service is accessible from within EU, you have to comply with the EU regulation. Another distribution, we have to now be in control of the entire distribution chain until our device is reaching the patient. It may be so, though, that if the distributor is a hospital and they are handing over the device to the patient, then it is the obligation of the hospital to keep track of which patient has received which devices. For software, it's kind of a special situation because we are having one device which is distributed and run in multiple instances. Nevertheless, we are required to keep track of the distribution chain, including also distribution through app stores. And app stores are probably due to this putting up more rigor assessments of devices or software and apps that are to be located within the medical section of the app stores, because otherwise we as manufacturer should be auditing them as they would be a critical supplier to us, a critical part of our distribution chain at least. And they, I'm sure they don't want to do that, or to have us auditing them. Yeah, these economic operators, manufacturer, importer, distributor, they are now also both important part of the traceability or distribution chain, but we are also to register them in the UDAMED database as with name and contact details and so forth. So that the EU know that we are working with these organizations. As mentioned earlier, software is up-classified as part of this legislative change. And one rule in the classification that is really, really important to software is Rule 11. Rule 11 and 1 and 10 applies to all software, but I think 99.something% of all softwares will be classified according to Rule 11. But for other types of devices that are or may also include software, there are more of those that may become class 3 devices as well. This Rule 11, I'd like to go through that in a little more detail because it's really important to understand that software that are intended to provide information which is based to is used to take decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes is classified as class 2A, meaning that provide information. Information can be a lot of things. It can, basically almost everything is information when we're talking about software, and therefore in general, this rule will apply to all softwares that have at least a clinical purpose. If the software can cause or contribute to a state where it could cause death or irreversible deterioration, the software would be classified as a class 3. If it's a serious deterioration of health or surgical intervention can relieve it, then it would be a class 2B. And for software that are intended to monitor physiological processes, they are in class 2A. The last one class is class 1, stating that all other software is classified as class 1. But in reality, this is just a failure of the author that they took in this one, because they have themselves difficult finding out which type of devices could be a class 1. And I gave an example earlier on with the pregnancy app that could actually end up in being a class 1, but otherwise, if it was to prevent pregnancy, it would be a class 2B device. Another way of looking at this is to look at where the information is to be used and the significance of that information. So if the app or the software is to be used in a non-serious situation, and it would only be informing or driving clinical management, it would obviously be in the lowest risk category of them all, but still they will be a class 2A. And informed clinical management is providing information of options for treating, diagnosing, preventing, mitigating diseases. So providing a lot of options where it will be the clinician who makes the decision for the next step, while drive clinical management will be to provide guidance towards a specific kind of treatment without specifying exactly how it is to be conducted, while treating and diagnosing is directly part of the providing the diagnosis or providing the treatment. So in this software that are running in an insulin pump would obviously be treatment. If it's a continuous glucose monitor, it would be probably, it would like to be an IVD device. So that's a bad example. If we are in a serious condition, or if better example, with a critical condition being like people are in intensive care units, and you are driving the next step decisions to which treatment that they should have, then you would be in a class 2B, or have a device which are in a class 2B. And this figure can be found both in the IMDR, International Medical Device Regulators Forum guidance document in 12 and in the MDSW 2019-11. The 1911 doesn't have this categorization that you can see behind here. 1 to 4, that's only in the international guidance. So the good thing here is that this kind of categorization is international, so it is actually applicable in all countries, more or less across the globe. So we are having the same basis for discussions with authorities worldwide, which is really good. Now, looking at the consequences that follows compliance with the medical device regulation, and especially also the up-classification of all these software from class 1 under the directives to a class 2A or 2B, probably in the medical device regulation, is that we are now required to have a quality management system. Actually, all medical devices under the medical device regulation is required to have a quality management system, which was not the case with the class 1 devices under the directive. But now, in addition, for all that is all those software that are classified, we have to have a certified quality management system as well. And where it previously was possible to use paper-based quality management system, it is no longer possible. It must be searchable. So we have to implement an electronic quality management system, and this is probably something that may have an impact on some companies at least. Then we are required to do more post-market clinical follow-up to evaluate on the performance of the device after placing on the market. So continuously monitor how it performs, identify risks, but also collect data that may be able to support new claims. And so this is not something that is just to be seen as a disadvantage, but actually also as an advantage, and especially for software, this exposes an opportunity, because software has the capability often to be able to communicate, and thereby we can actually continuously follow how our software is performing and how it's used in the market, at least if it's not behind some kind of firewall all means that prevents us to get this kind of information. Clinical evidence is also something an area where more information is required and where we need to do more. Previously, a lot of devices has been placed on the market by stating equivalence to another device that was previously in the market. That is no longer possible. We cannot use a previous device as an equivalence device if that device has been using another device as a equivalent device. And thereby this no grandfathering. And it basically means that for all devices has to have the clinical evidence, the clinical data on our own, within our own company for the devices that we are manufacturing. We are also facing additional requirements for qualification of authors and evaluators of the clinical evaluation report. And we are to look more into the clinical benefits and also the benefit risk analysis must be assessed by. Benefit risk is a little funny thing with the 14971 standard. The previous version it was a risk benefit, now it's a benefit risk. So yeah, just one of the minor changes there in terminology. Anyway, notified body involvement is also now more required, or more often required for software devices as due to this up-classification, as all class 2A and above devices has to have the technical documentation and the quality management system assessed by a notified body. Then there's, as part of this traceability, as previously mentioned, the unique device identifier with a unique device identifier, and production identifier part has to be on all releases, and I have an example of how that's done later after the break. More technical information, the technical file, but here we are having actually quite a good situation because the general safety and performance requirements are much more specific on what is required as opposed to the directive. So it's kind of easier to establish compliance with the individual requirements. Sad thing, or for patients is good probably, is that we need to provide more details in the technical documentation. Then there's also a requirement to have a person responsible for regulatory compliance of regulatory requirements in the company, and there are some explicit requirements for such person that they have a university degree and 1 year in medical device QA/RA, or minimum 4 years in a medical device QA/RA function to enter a company as a person responsible for regulatory compliance. And the good thing is that for small enterprises, you can use an external to fulfill this role until you have existed long enough to have one of your internals to be this person. Liability is also an area where there are some increased requirements for financial coverage. Fortunately, it is though proportionate to the risk class and size of the company and device types that are manufactured. UDAMED was also mentioned, and UDAMED is a new pan-European database where we are to register all manufacturers, all devices, all the UDIs of devices together with economic operators and post-market information, clinical information. So a lot of information are to be uploaded for each device into this UDAMED database. Good thing is that it provides a single registration option So we will only in the future need to register once and not have to register with all the European national authorities. So that's an advantage, but it has just recently become open for registrations, but it is actually open now for some part of the registration, not all of them. Electronic instructions for use. It may these days look like a kind of simple thing to work with, but actually there's a separate regulation, 207-2012, regulating electronic use of electronic instructions for use in medical devices. And now it's explicit in the medical device regulation that we need to follow this regulation as well. So a look into the quality management system. It can be structured in a way so that we have a base layer which is supporting with management commitment and infrastructure, work environment, and all the human resource that are needed to develop the device. And then we have a supporting process layer which is providing the document control and configuration management, controlling outsourcing and planning risk management. And then we have the core activities, which is the actual product realization or development and manufacturing processes. And we'll get more into those later on. The structure of such quality management system can be looking like this, where we have the quality manual at the top, and it's expressing or explaining how the processes of our quality management system are interacting and who has responsibility to what, and defining typically also the scope of the quality management system. Then we have a procedure level, which is high level overview of who does what and sometimes also when they are to do stuff, while the instruction layer is expanding and explaining in more details how to do the individual steps of such a procedure. And then we'll have a bunch of templates and forms, etc., to support the actual conduct of the instruction. So it may say, instruction says that we have to conduct a code review and use a certain checklist. Then we'll have the template for such, or form for such in ready. Could also be questionnaires for use as part of the usability. When these are filled in, and it may also be other records that we have actually followed instructions, they are become records. And just an example of how such a process may look like is that we have our process is defined by taking some input, going through a set of activities and providing some output. And for each of these activities, we have a procedure written, which may be supplied by one or more instructions, which all of them are providing a set of records. And this is mentioned because it's really, really crucial that you align terminology if you are gathering staff from different companies. Sometimes SOPs are regarded as instructions and other terminology issues that can cause confusion. The process to be defined as part of the quality management system, and I'm sorry for rushing a little through these, but time is running, I think. Is for risk management. Risk management process is at the heart of everything. It's influenced everything that we do when dealing with medical devices. The quality management is affected by risk management, usability, clinical, biocompatibility, general safety, software labeling. Those in gray are not relevant for software, obviously, but all the other ones are typical processes that needs to be defined and described in as part of the quality management system. After the break, I will be diving a little bit more into details on the planning and execution part, which is describing the development and how we establish the documentation package to be delivered to authorities. But this slide is just stating that now we have been looking at the analysis part, which is the identify applicable legislations, classifications to figure out, and then we need to do a quality management system. Now, next step will be to develop it. At the end, we'll compile the technical file and have it assessed by authorities, and then do the registrations and place the product on the market. The next part will be about demonstrating compliance, fulfilling the general safety and performance requirements. And I've only picked a few of them to give examples on how to interpret them. Now, for those that are, I picked those that are most relevant to software or specifically addressing software. And here we are having some that are addressing usability, which is the GSPR 14.6, and there are quite a few of them, 23 sections with a lot of, or some of them at least, have a lot of subsections. But one of them is that we have to design the device in order to take care of economical, in respect of economical principles and environmental conditions, meaning the use environment where the device is to be used. So it's a different set of usability requirements based on whether it's home environment or if it's intensive care unit or where you are to use the device. For software and mobile devices, also the size of screen and contrast ratios, addressing whether we are intending the device to be used or the software to be used during transport, so that we would be able to look at things in the bright sunlight, or if we have to be inside in relatively dark room. An example here could be like having a mobile app to look through X-ray images or MR images of a brain to identify tumors. That might not be the best solution to have for use outside in bright sun while we're having looking at dark images. So we'll probably be blinded by the sunlight there. So we need to think about these issues, and therefore we are to follow the IEC 62366-1 standard regarding usability evaluation for these devices. And it contains requirements for both to do the specification of the use up front and do formative evaluations, playing ball with real users or usability experts in order to design the individual user phases early stage, have them developed, and at the end of the process after software release to do a summative evaluation with a almost release ready software where we are to involve a certain amount of user groups and a certain amount of people in each of these user groups. Typically, it would be required a good number of people in the usability. Each user group would be some 6 people, because in the supporting standard, the IEC 62366-2, which is a guidance document for this one, it is there is a graph where it illustrates that with 6 people you reach about 82% of all, or catch 82% of all usability errors. If you are planning to go for the US, you need to be careful here, because this FDA human factors engineering guidance document, which is quite good for inspiration, but if you're going for the US market, you have to be careful, because it explicitly requires to have 15 people in each distinct user group. And this could be doctors, nurses, and home care users. Could be 3 user groups for one device, and you need to have 15 in each of these user groups. So that's a lot of people to involve in in this usability evaluation. Interoperability. So if we're stating that we are able to exchange information on a public interface like the IEEE 11033 to collect information from weight scales or glucose meters or thermometers or any other device that are compliant with these standards as well, we have to state and document that we are actually reliable and safe in this compatibility or interoperability. And that can be done actually by having a certification to one of these standards or following a particular standard and then stating compliance with that, document compliance with that standard. Risk management requirement number 2 is to reduce risk as far as possible, and number 3 is to establish a risk management system. This kind of illustrates that it is really important to have risk management in scope of all activities. And the relevant standards here is the 14972 from 2019. That is the risk management standard to use. And when we're talking about software, there's a technical report, the IEC 80002-1, which is describing how to apply the 14971 standard for software explicitly. Then there's also one for the post-market surveillance part, and I'll address that one also later, this 20416 standard, which is also relevant in that context. For cybersecurity, which is another hot topic, and I should say that especially cybersecurity and usability has been really something that the notified body has been diving into and been kind of scrutinizing in the audits that has been for the medical device regulation. So something that you must take care to address. And there's quite a lot of these cybersecurity related requirements for maintenance, how to establish that they can actually perform maintenance of the software without exposing this maintenance port to unintended personnel. And in some cases, actually, this part is quite closely related to the usability part, because human factors is really an issue there. Then there's also the negative interaction between software and the IT environment, so that we do not expose the hardware to something that is not intended to. Tampering is another area where it's important to address or prevent that we can tamper, or at least that we are able to detect that somebody has been trying to tamper with our software. And that actually also goes on the distribution part. So whenever we're coming from a build and we're putting it into Docker or some other cloud storage before it's ready to be deployed somewhere, we need to take care and ensure that nobody can actually tamper the software unless it's at least detectable that it has been tampered with in those repositories where the software is located. Some of those standards that are really relevant to look at here is the UL 2900 and the TIR 57. And I highly recommend the TIR 57 as a really good standard to read for addressing these cybersecurity related issues. There's also a guidance document, this 2019-16, which are also explaining how to address cybersecurity within MDR. And then FDA has they actually have several good guidance documents on how to handle cybersecurity, both pre-market and post-market. So that could be really good to use for inspiration and guidance how to handle cybersecurity. They're really on the beat with cybersecurity. And then there's these life cycle requirements to develop according to state of the art and ensure repeatability, reliability, and performance. in line with the intended use, and it has to be developed according to state of the art. And here I say even the relevant standard is to follow is the IEC 62304. Hopefully, most of our developers they will think that okay, this is actually the way to develop software, even though it may seem like it's very waterfall-like, but in reality it can be implemented in a very agile way as well. So looking more into these areas with risk management, the process of risk management is to do the analysis, evaluate the analysis to identify those hazards and hazardous situations where something can go wrong with the during use of the device or in the design of the device, and then evaluate the probabilities and effects of these. And when we're talking about software, the possibility to determine actually a possibility of failure for software is almost impossible. So therefore, it is required to set the possibility of failure to 100% for all softwares, and only if we are using mitigation or risk control measures outside of the software we can start using probability, and that allows us also, if we have two different parts of the software which are running in two different processes, different memory spaces, they can actually be mitigating one another, and thereby we can make use of probability. But also clinical procedures may be part of this mitigation. And the mitigation is the next step, where we identify how to handle all these hazards that has been identified, and where we have determined probability and effect to be beyond an acceptable level. We have defined these risk control measures and implement them, and then evaluate on the overall residual risk. Conduct a review that we have actually been conducting everything as described in the risk management plan, which are describing how to do all this, who should do it, when it has to be done, what to be done, and how it has to be done, including these acceptability criteria. And then we can maybe end up with a statement where we need to do something post-market, and that is included then in the post-market surveillance plan, and that's why I was referring to this 24416 standard just before. Usability, another aspect which is very closely related to risk management as well. And I'm sorry if this figure may not be that readable, but I'm sure those of you who will be working with usability will be reading this in the 62366-2 standard. But it just describes these steps that I already mentioned, with some research and then understanding the user and the use scenarios, analyzing and figuring out how to establish the best possible way forward with defining workflows and designing user interfaces. Then conducting the formative evaluation with a number of users, and then finally do the summative evaluation. And I'll get back to where these fit in just in a few minutes. On cybersecurity, there's also a requirement to establish a cybersecurity risk process, which is very identical actually to the safety risk process. This part is fully identical to what we were just looking at, and as you can see, it's the same steps to go through, just with the security mindset, where we on the safety part would be involving clinicians to evaluate the probabilities and the effect and potential harm to patients for how our software can contribute to it, and what the consequences would be, we would need to involve some cybersecurity experts or IT personnel with experience in cybersecurity in the risk process for that part, because this equal to the clinicians have their specialties. Cybersecurity is a specialty in its own, and and therefore we need to establish a different risk analysis group for the cybersecurity risk analysis. What's important here is that any risk control measures established to mitigate a potential cybersecurity risk has to be inserted into the safety risk analysis and evaluated as part of that to evaluate whether it would pose a safety risk. And that's because what we're really interested in is to identify those security risks which may have a potential safety impact, and then mitigate those to ultimately prevent any harm to patients. And the harm to patients is identified in the 14971 standard as being injury or damage to the health of people or damage to property or the environment. That includes also harm to data, and this is different from the previous version of the standard, where it was physical injury that was stated. Now it's actually also could be as a breach of data or reduction of effectiveness of a device that could be compromised by through cybersecurity attacks, and thereby causing a potential safety risk. So it's really important to be aware of this cycle, to go through it until we have mitigated to an acceptable level on both processes. Post-market surveillance activities. Once we have found out that we are not maybe able to mitigate everything to the lowest possible level, and we may also need some additional clinical evidence, and so we take that into our post-market surveillance activities to go through it and collect information from the market proactively in order to be able to state these continued compliance and detect potential risks that may occur during device usage. And also for the clinical part, if we do not have sufficient data to fully state or document any claims, clinical claims, then we can also use this post-market data collection to establish data to support those claims. It is required to do a periodic safety update report for all Class 2A, 2B, and 3 devices. For Class 2A, it's on a bi-yearly, or every 2 years it is, to submit this periodic safety update report, and it has to be uploaded to the UDAMED as well. This is something new. This was not under the old the directive. Any data that is collected as part of this process has to be analyzed to identify trends. So it could be that for instance, you experience that people are having increasing problems logging in or performing certain tasks as part of their daily use. Then the trend analysis will give you an input to make an adjustment or make an update on those areas. It could also be that the complaints and complaints are any feedback coming from the market. That those complaints are in a specific type of complaints. Then you could also identify that you may have an increasing amount of a certain type of complaints and then start reacting on that. So therefore, it's important to establish a good way of analyzing your data collected in order to detect these trends and mitigate potential risks and do also enhancements to your device. And all of these outputs of the data analysis are to be submitted to a management review as part of this quality management cycle. The evaluation is established by assessing and analyzing clinical data pertaining to the device in order to verify this clinical safety and performance. And it can be done based on literature or on data, include usability, the risk analysis is important as well as part of input to this. And it can be, if we are using an equivalent data, a device that we can actually make use of, it could be one of our own products, but it could also be a competitor if they are willing to share that data with us. Anyways, to establish such a clinical evaluation, it's important to establish a clinical association by looking at the functionalities within the device and stating whether that functionality is relevant and related to a certain clinical area. Second, to conduct an analytical validation, and I'll get to that in a second as well. Which is basically the verification activities, testing conducted on the software or the device, checking that we have actually built the device according to specifications, so to verify that it's accurate and reliable. And the last part is the clinical validation, which may partly also involves the usability evaluation, but here the important thing is to validate whether what claims we have made on the device is actually fulfilled, and that the user needs we have set out to develop a device for, that it is actually fulfilled. So verification versus validation. That verification is that we have developed the device according to specifications, and that the validation is that we have actually developed a device that the user can use. Now, when we are almost ready to launch the device, we have to ensure that it's also traceable after we have placed it on the market. And for this, the unique device identifier is required. And as we just looked at earlier, the UDI is split in two parts: a device identifier and production identifier, where the device identifier is the same if there are no significant changes, while the unique UDI PI part is changing with every software build. So we will have a lot of these generated with every software release. Basically, we'll have a new UDI PI, but we only need to purchase the UDI DI part, and that it has to be purchased by, for instance, the GS1. But there are other providers of these device identifiers also. The device identifier is company and device specific, and cannot be used for any other device as the one that it has been registered for, and it also has to be registered in the UDAMED database. Such barcode or to describe the UDI, it can be either a QR code or a barcode, and this is an example on how the label could look like within the software, and it should be containing at least these informations, and often also the intended purpose as part of the label in the about box or in a pop-up screen while starting up or something. Typically also in the instructions for use, you will have a manual like this. And if you're using electronic instruction for use, you must have a link to where you can find those manuals. So, yeah. Now, tying everything, all these individual components up into a flow or a process for product realization coming from the user needs through definition of the intended purpose and the initial risk assessment to identify which product classification it is, and maybe also a software safety classification. And here I should mention also that software is having a separate classification regime as to the product classification, where software is divided into class A, B, and C, where class C is something where software can contribute to death or irreversible harm. B is that it can contribute to a reversible harm, or A, that it cannot at all contribute to harm. So in most cases, class B is the one that applies. Rarely that it's C and let's say A is okay for some part. I would not recommend developing anything according to A, but yeah, that's a different story. That's too detailed for today, probably. After defining the intended purpose, we define this use requirements, which is part of the usability flow, and we can, based on that and the intended purpose, we can start establishing a validation plan for, like, identifying which user groups to use for evaluating a certain UI, or also for the clinical part, for that matter. It's also an input to establishing a set of system level requirements or design inputs, which may include UI specifications and the formative evaluations before we can actually start the software development. And this may conflict with the typical thoughts about how things are done. But I think, well, it's to my experience that it's a good idea to kind of split in a product focus and a component or software focus. And there are two reasons. I mean, it is to be able to maintain a focus on the product from what's called from a certain abstract layer, and then to develop things in-house, or you may be able to outsource it. But if you specify to the level where you specify the product, it will be easier to outsource parts. And when you are outsourcing, you are to still be in control of everything in the yellow box, but obviously you will be in control of that while developing in-house. But you may, if the supplier that you are using are actually maybe even 13485 certified, and they are compliant with the 62304, you could reduce the level of insight that you would need to have. And then in that case, we would have a touch point where we're handing over the high-level requirements to the development group, and then start breaking down and identifying, figuring out how it should actually look like as part of the development cycle, until we reach a design output where this would actually be the software release, from which we would be able to validate it and establish the user needs has been met, and make a launch into the market. Part of this cycle is, of course, also the risk management. Risk management is included in everything, every single step across it. We should address risk. Sometimes it's enough just to evaluate whether risk assessment is needed. And other times we need to do some risk analysis. After market, we collect these post-market informations and all other types of feedback from the market. And some of them will be feature requests, which are entered into the requirement specification. Others will be support issues, which are handled by support. and some will be bug reports. And bug reports basically should just be added as design inputs and follow the exact same procedures for software development as any other changes to the software to ensure a good, consistent way of working. And in all of these steps, there will be a set of inputs, a set of outputs, and a number of activities to conduct, and which we would like to document and establish records that we have actually conducted those parts. And it will be in any of these steps. If you dive a little further into the details of this one and looking at it like a V model, we'll be able to establish that we can come to a stage where we have the design inputs, and then below this stipulated line will be actually looking into the yellow box here. So there we'll be breaking down into software requirements, evaluate whether architecture design is needed to be updated, or if it's the first requirement run, then we will establish architectural design, do the module design and do the coding, unit verification, maybe code review, it may be unit testing, integration testing, evaluating whether the architecture is fulfilling requirements, system testing that we have actually implemented all the software requirements. And the agile part here is actually how fast can we just go through a cycle here. So we can iterate within a sprint of whatever terminology you are using. We can iterate many times here before we reach a state where we can actually release the software for acceptance test, system level testing. And if we're really good at it, we have established a strong traceability between the test cases run here, the software requirement, and the input requirement, so we would have less work done after software release and can go more or less straight to validation and finally product release. Important here, traceability across any time, and if we're supporting this by tool implementation, we have a good possibility to automate a lot of the documentation that is otherwise required in this. Risk analysis again is very important, and risk is conducted, risk assessment in all steps. We are looking at risk. Have we gotten any new information, got wiser, so that we would need to add new risks to the software? And it may be that the mitigation is just entered into the software requirement. It may also be that we need to make a change at product level, then it has to be updated to the product level risk analysis, and then made modifications perhaps to the product level requirements. And this is of course a lot in details, but just to illustrate to you that there is a lot of work in the software development cycle here to conduct, and it is possible to do it in a very agile way and in an efficient way if supported by tools, and the implementation here is really key. So change management is made lean, so we don't have to spend days in order to get a review of a new design input if we need to make some changes. A few reminders in the summary. Determine, if you have not done so already, for your device, what's the purpose of the device, who's intended to use it, where is the device intended to be used, I mean in the use environment, intensive care, home environment, in a ward. How will the device fulfill its purpose? Is it using machine learning, AI? Is it using data coming from in vitro diagnostic devices, or how is it actually processing these data in order to define this intended purpose? Then do the overall risk analysis to evaluate the risk classification and potentially also how the software may contribute to a harm occurring, and thereby getting an insight to what is the software safety classification. Classifying the device and the classification determines the compliance rigor and level of insight that the authorities shall have to our documentation and to our processes. Start establishing a quality management system. It is required for every manufacturer of medical devices to have a quality management system. If it is to be certified, initiate a dialogue with the notified body and start planning, because this may easily take half a year before you can reach a certification of your quality management system. Fortunately, it looks like that most notified bodies are actually having quite a good capacity for software-only devices, whereas for physical devices, or especially devices which have tissue or biological components into it, are looking into very, very long lines of waiting. And when in all of this, establishing processes and instructions, make sure to establish them in a way that they will become a value asset in your everyday work, so that they will be supporting your work workflow on an everyday basis, and where possible, establish tools to help supporting these processes. It becomes a lot more efficient, your quality management system, if you're doing so, and with better efficiency you will reach more compliance, and with more compliance you'll have an easier task with the notified body. So it's a really good idea to look into how we can make these requirements into a value add in the company. And that's it from my side now.
Let's move on to some questions that we've been getting throughout your presentation. To what extent the service providers, like software development agencies, need to comply with the new regulations and be certified in order to provide their services to medical software manufacturers?
Meaning service providers like Amazon and or that kind of services, they will be a part of your risk analysis conducted on the device, whether your service, the services that you make use of. So when if you're running a cloud-based service in Amazon Cloud or in Microsoft Azure, you will be evaluating them as a supplier, conducting a supplier evaluation on them, stating that they are capable and safe to use for supporting your device, and that way around you will be working with it. Risk analysis will be important, of course, also, especially when it comes to cybersecurity. But in reality, you could also argue by safety by numbers that these services are used by so many people on a daily basis that it's really crucial to their business to have a strong uptime and provide a strong service.
Next question. Is the EU MDR regulation similar to FDA registration, or does it require completely separate processes and quality management systems?
No, actually, with the latest edition of the 13485 standard for quality management system, it is very much aligned with the FDA, and actually the FDA is to replace their existing quality system regulations with the 13485 standard. So it's going to be actually easier to enter both the EU and the US markets. Actually, for devices like the ones we're talking about here, software devices, currently it seems easier to go with the FDA or more predictable process to go with the FDA than it is to enter the market in EU. But the regulatory framework, the classification regime, the standards used is the same in both markets.
Right, thank you. Is MDR affecting cloud service providers from outside of Europe, like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google?
Yes and no. They are not affected as such when they do not provide medical devices. But if you are running, as we just talked about a little earlier, if you're running your service on top of any of these cloud services, then they will be indirectly affected, but it will be you as a manufacturer of your own software to make the judgment that you're running in a safe environment. So it will be your responsibility as a manufacturer.
Great, thank you. Okay, a very good question here. What to do if you didn't follow the procedure from the start of your development process?
What? Anybody did? No, I guess nobody really does that from the beginning. So it will be a matter of actually looking from a gap analysis point of view and look how does it look today, and actually the 62304 has explicit section that addresses this legacy software, and also for the usability part there's a part that addresses legacy software, and it basically states that you need to do a risk analysis on your existing device, existing software, establish a good plan for how to bring it on track, usually in control and in compliance, and then then start doing it with a justification why it's still okay to continue to use your legacy software, and nobody will be going back and do reverse engineering and establish documentation from all the existing, but a good plan will eventually bring everything in place.
That almost sounded like famous last words, but we do have some more questions. Next question, what is Udemy, and do health tech companies need to do anything in this regard?
Yes, and as just mentioned in the presentation, Udemy is just recently launched, and it is a pan-European database for registration of medical devices manufacturers and economic operators like distributors or authorized representatives, if you would be coming from outside EU, for registration of suppliers and adverse events and some parts of the technical documentation or documentation package you would otherwise make available to the authorities, and also the person responsible for regulatory compliance has to be registered there, even with both first and last name, email, phone number, what the person is responsible for, and physical address as well. So in some part of it is actually quite detailed that we need to register, and all manufacturers must be registered in the Udemy. All devices must be registered in the Udemy. All UDIs must be registered in the Udemy, and we have to update continuously to the Udemy database. So it's going to be a huge repository of information for all medical devices in the European market. Actually, we have a similar database called MODE in the US, where you can find a lot of information on all devices that are placed on the market in the US, and it's a really interesting database to look at if you when you are to conduct a risk analysis.
Thank you. Okay, here's another one. How will MDR affect my existing QMS?
So if your current QMS is certified to 13485/2016, and you're working with standalone software, the impact will not be that big actually. But there are some additional requirements for post-market surveillance, for vigilance, and how to report to the authorities. But if you have been in a good shape before MDR, then you are still in a good shape. Then the process for registration with the UNIMED and the added requirement for technical documentation, for instance, on cybersecurity and usability is something that obviously will affect the existing process. But if you're in compliance with those standards, then the impact is not that big.
What are some of the most critical post-market responsibilities health tech startups need to be aware of?
Well, post-market surveillance is now mandatory, and it is mandatory to be proactive, meaning that you are required to pursue information in the market on your own and competitor products as well, as failures of competitor products may also have be relevant to your product, at least in the risk analysis. And it can be conducted actually in many ways by questionnaires or monitoring your device or monitoring social media if you're a consumer targeted device. But otherwise, the post-market clinical follow-up on how your device is performing in the market is really an important thing to have in mind. And it's tightly related to the risk analysis, again, a risk management process.
Is MDR acknowledged outside of EU, especially in emerging markets?
That's actually a quite good question, and I'm not sure what to answer. With the Medical Device Directive, it was so that 93 countries outside EU actually recognized the CE mark, and I'm not up to date whether these markets are still accepting the CE mark to the directive, or if they are now requiring the CE marking to the regulation. I think they will in time, but I'm not fully up to date on what is the current state in all of these countries. But yes, they will be eventually accepting.
It almost sounds like we should do a follow-up event.
Yeah, that would be interesting. It would require some investigation to figure that one out. But you say with the countries like Israel, if you have either an FDA approval or a CE mark, then it's more or less only a registration. And then you have an additional market outside EU. Canada and Australia, New Zealand are also markets which are interesting and that are accepting the CE mark with a few additional limitations.
Right. Well, that was all the questions we had today from our participants and from some of our members. So thank you so much, Brian Hedegaard, for sharing your knowledge on MDR and everything there's to know for health tech startups. All that remains for us now is to say thank you for everyone who participated today. Please remember to check out the Health Tech Hub Copenhagen website for our upcoming events in 2021. And of course, go and visit Probatus to find out even more about MDR. And hope to see you again soon at another Health Tech Hub Copenhagen event. Thank you and goodbye for today.
Thank you. Goodbye.